Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's All Things Policy at Takshashila Institution. I am Brigadier Anil Raman.
Hi, I am Air Marshal T.D. Joseph, retired.
The past 5 weeks have seen the outbreak and the staggered escalation of the war in the Persian Gulf between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side. The conflict has witnessed so far mainly an air and missile campaign in which the United States and Israel have relied mainly on an air campaign, and Iran has made extensive use of missiles. In today's All Things Policy, Air Marshal Joseph and I will get into the nitty-gritties of the air and missile campaigns and draw lessons for India. Firstly, why does this conflict matter? This conflict is important to India for multiple reasons, namely energy security, macroeconomic stability, and of course, the security of the neighborhood and Asia in general. Our assessments are all based on open source data as available on April 6th. And today the central lens is based on the tactical successes of US and Israel, which is comparatively high. The operational success is contested and the strategic outcome is unresolved. Keep these things in mind throughout our discussion today. Before we get into the analysis proper, I'd just like to highlight the timeline of this conflict. The conflict actually began not just this year, but way back with the 12-day war in June 2025, when Israel struck Iran's nuclear and air defense infrastructure. The United States joined with B-2 bombers and the GBU's 57 massive ordnance penetrator bombardment against Natanz and Fordow, both Iranian nuclear facilities. A ceasefire ended the round with Iran's nuclear program set back assessed months to 2 years. The Phase 2, or Operation Epic Fury, began on February 28, 2026. The US Israelis, in a surprise strike, reportedly killed the Supreme Leader Khamenei and decapitated the IRGC command hierarchy. Iran retaliated with mass missile and drone barrages across all the GCC states, Israel, and US bases, and the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed.
And we now can consider ourselves to be in the third phase, presumably, which is heading towards the end game. We know that many publicly reported sources that 7,000 to 9,000 plus targets have been struck so far in as much as 6,500 and more air sorties. Currently, there are about 57,000 US troops in the entire West Asian theater, which will become a substantially large force when and if it is called upon to intervene. We are also aware of some of the losses that have happened to what we considered to be unbeatable powers, the US and Israel combined. The recent loss of F-15E shot down over enemy territory and the pilots landing over enemy territory is something new for the American forces, not happened since the late 1990s. We also are aware of the A-10 being shot down, though now finally crashing in friendly territories. Reports of an F-35 being damaged, losses of 6 to 8 air-to-air refueling tankers, 18 Reaper unmanned aerial systems, up to at least 12 radars and communication terminals, which have been destroyed thus far. We know that the Houthis have entered the conflict, and there's talk of a 45-day framework for ceasefire, which is under discussion, though, of course, not agreed to by Israel. Therefore, the deal status is still fluid at the time of our recording. So we need to consider why the US and Israel thought that air power alone could decide on a victorious outcome in this conflict. But sad to say that despite historical lessons to the contrary, The US as well as the Israeli leadership believed that air dominance and precision strikes at scale, leading to annihilation of enemy capabilities, could actually collapse a regime's will and its capabilities simultaneously. But historical evidence proves otherwise. Vietnam, Gulf Wars 1 and 2, and even Afghanistan to some extent required ground forces operations to change the regimes. Kosovo in 1999 needed a threat of ground operations finally for President Milosevic to capitulate. Let's look at the perceived vulnerabilities of Iran. Okay, what has happened thus far is that its outdated air force, suffering from various sanctions and supply chain of spares being totally denied, have been decimated, which is a fact. Its outdated air defense systems, except what we are not aware of the latest inductions, have been destroyed completely. Their highly personalized leadership structure made them susceptible to decapitation, but the final outcome of that is still questionable since we do have an effective leadership still in command.
There was also the decapitation theory, which was sort of supported the overwhelming employment of air power. Kill Khamenei and the IRGC command chain, and the regime collapses from within or loses coherent retaliatory ability. This was what the Israelis learned from Hamas and Hezbollah in 2024. Another reason for, relying on air so extensively, I think, was the sort of errors in the intelligent assessment. The US and Israeli planners underestimated Iran's missile and drone dispersal, and very critically, the pre-delegation of launch authority. Now, what this means is that commanders had been empowered to retaliate without waiting for centralized sanction, which means even if you cut off the head, the arms and the limbs of the organization will continue to function independently. And also, they overestimated the fragility of a system that had been preparing for this very scenario for the past 20 years. Also, there is this whole philosophy of the US in which munitions over troops as the political preference. No US administration can sustain politically the casualty of ground operations beyond a certain limit. And air power offered the illusion of a decisive effect without body bags. Trump's drill baby drill energy posture made the Gulf disruption appear tolerable. In other words, domestic production could compensate for external imports. Therefore, the political pain would not be that much. So the result was that in 37 days in, Iran's air force is destroyed and the navy is largely gone, but its missile and drone campaign continues, and the Hormuz Strait remains controlled, and the strategic objective of the United States and Israel are unachieved.
So that means there has been a fundamental miscalculation as far as employment of air power is concerned. The belief that air power can destroy capability but cannot by itself destroy the will is what we need to consider and remember. It cannot destroy the will or coerce a regime that has hardened its population, especially when you consider that Iranian population is a 7,000-year-old civilization. Iran has understood this. The US has once again, sad to say, relearned it.
Can we get into the details of the US and Israeli air campaign to parse out, what was achieved and what was not?
Okay, let's do that by looking at the force as well as your objectives. Okay, the objectives had been those stated multiple times and varied from as the day went from first to second to third. Okay, destroy the nuclear program of Iran completely, neutralize its missile as well as drone launch capacity, as also the manufacturing capacity, neutralize the missile launchers and not only the missiles, suppress and destroy its air defenses through suppression of enemy air defense and destruction of enemy air defense, decapitate the IRGC leadership, and collapse the naval capacity. Though US kept on denying the change of regime as a primary aim, we know that it was operationally pursued. As far as the scale is concerned, the scale of employment is concerned, we know US and Israel have thrown all the air assets, critical air assets, most modern air assets that they have into this war. the B-2 Spirit with the massive ordnance penetrators, which you just mentioned, B-1B, and once total air superiority was achieved, B-52s coming in conventional strike role. We have the F-35s, we've had the F-35s and the F-22s, which have been capable of penetrating deep in stealth mode undetected and effectively carrying out suppression of enemy air defenses, followed by the F-15E Strike Eagles coming into the theater, as also the naval F-18 and Marine Corps F-35C, the carrier-based F-35C forces being employed, along with electronic warfare and SEAD assets. And also, finally, in the last few days, once the US forces were certain of total air dominance in this theater, the ATOM close air support and maritime interdiction role fighter aircraft, close air support aircraft, coming to the theater, as also the AC-130 night precision fires. Supporting these operations are the force enablers. It is reported that nearly 33% of US tanker fleet, air-to-air refueler fleet, have been deployed. That would put that figure somewhere close to 200, considering that the US has reportedly have about 600 plus air-to-air refuelers. 66 to 75% of its AVAX fleet have been committed. That would mean about 20 of these platforms. We are aware that 3 aircraft carriers are in the region, or maybe quite far away, but still able to bring its operations to some extent. These are Abraham Lincoln, Gerald R. Ford, and George W. Bush, which is en route at the moment. We are also aware of 18 bombers, additional bombers, being positioned at Royal Air Force Base at Fairford. And then we have the shift in the type of munitions that have been employed. We saw the high-end precision-guided munitions, high-cost, high-caliber munitions used in the initial days. And that would have been in the anticipation of a quick capitulation of the Iranian regime and the government and its military capabilities, which unfortunately has not happened. Therefore, what has happened is the ability of the US and Israeli forces to sustain these high-tempo operations with the modern weapons has taken a hit, necessitating them to transition to cheaper JDAMs, which cost less than $100,000, and obviously after the air superiority was achieved, which actually points towards a structural burn rate problem in the US munitions inventory.
But let me first sort of cover what did work, because the employment of all these resources certainly did have an effect. 60 to 70% of Iranian ballistic missile launchers have been assessed to be neutralized. CENTCOM, of course, has claimed 70%, but our figures suggest about 60%. Iran's Air Force and Surface Navy has effectively been destroyed. 100 plus naval vessels have been damaged or sunk. Bandar Abbas and Chabahar have been struck in the early hours itself. Iranian daily missile fire rate has been reduced from 90 on day 1 to 10 to 15 by week 5. That's 85% tempo reduction. Though residual capability persists and the accuracy of these missiles which are being employed now has increased. My assessment is that it is not just loss of capability, it is also deliberate holding back of reserves for employment at a later stage in the conflict. The production ecosystem targeting from mid-March, that is missile factories, drone assembly lines, storage depots, and the counter-industrial phase now is the campaign's operational focus.
At the same time, let's look at what did not work in the campaign thus far. Well, the US, as well as all of us, assumed that the obsolescent air defense and air systems of Air Force of Iran has been decimated, and the US and Israeli forces, air forces, could operate with impunity over Iranian territory. But the fact of American F-15 fighter jet being shot down over enemy territory in more than 20 years, after more than 20 years, directly contradicts the US claims and Trump's claims that Iran had no anti-aircraft equipment, which he stated about a week or two ago. It confirms that how much our SEAD and DIAD are undertaken, the ability to suppress residual manpads, that's heat-seeking shoulder-fired missiles, as well as other short-range surface-to-air missile capability can never be assured. We also had the scenarios of an A-10C being down in the same 24-hour period of 2nd of April. And thereafter, during the combat search and rescue operations, we are aware that 2 Black Hawks, which were sent to extricate a pilot from ejected aircrew from the theater, were under fire and have suffered damages. Along with that, there are reports of 2 C-130Js along with 2 H-60 Jolly Green helicopters being damaged after they were committed towards CSR, presumably. And the US forces had to resort to destroying these intentionally so as not to allow the enemy to capture them and show as war booty. Okay. Well, the rescue operation itself became a significant combat action with diversionary and decoy strikes and diversionary tactics. And also, obviously, it has proven to be a successful operation. The other aspect is the vulnerability of high-value air assets like the tankers and AWACS and AEW&C in the open. Assuming that the Iranian forces have been decimated, air superiority has been achieved, that was a wrong step because the missiles could still strike, as proven by the missile strike on Prince Sultan Air Base, which is, of course, assisted by ISR and intelligence input from possibly China and Russia. So we know the results. 1 E-3 AWACS, at least 5 KC-135 tankers being attacked. These are critical combat enablers, the nervous system of the air campaign, and it's not just its muscles. We are aware of the friendly fire of 3 F-15s being shot down by Kuwaiti air defenses or aircraft, pointing towards coalition environment management vis-a-vis IFF, identification front of facilities, interoperability, as well as rules of engagement between allies. We also have the reported case of 2 tankers colliding in the air over Iranian space, unfortunately leading to the death of 1 aircraft's crew and the other, of course, forced landing back in Israel. Actually, these attacks over the bases in Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia showed the importance of hardened aircraft shelters and blast barriers, even when you assume that you have ultimate superiority, necessitating or forcing the Pentagon to demand at short notice blast barriers to protect their equipment in these areas. They should have actually pre-positioned this. In the initial days, it's reported that close to 1,000 Patriot interceptor missiles were fired in the first 4 days alone, which is equivalent to nearly 18 months of combined US factory production. The terminal high-altitude air defense stocks have been critically stressed. The coalition, actually, that's Israeli and US coalition, is now rationing expensive interceptors with cheaper alternatives. The Israeli Iron Dome itself, the ones considered to be totally invincible, is being susceptible to saturation as well as stock depletion rates. So the core lesson in these aspects is the world's 2 most capable air forces, while they achieved significant tactical victories against a mid-tier adversary, they have not managed to achieve a strategic endpoint. Precision without persistence and firepower without termination strategy are not sufficient. SEAD is never complete. Force enablers are as vulnerable as the shooters.
These are some of the lessons which have also emerged from the very imaginative and asymmetric Iranian missile and drone campaign. The Iranians' doctrine, what is emerging now, is that it is about cost imposition and not about victory. See, realistically, the Iran has realized that achieving air superiority is not feasible. And it is survival and cost imposition which is sufficient to coerce a negotiated halt. And its campaign has moved along 2 escalation axes. One is horizontal, that is widening geographically to punish the GCC states, and vertical, deepening the targets into the civilian dependent infrastructure. So not only are you seeing them attacking all these countries where the US is based, but you're also seeing them attack critical infrastructure, which then immediately raises the strategic level effects by targeting the economic and social systems that sort of underpin the adversary's political will. And what I'd like to highlight is this is not an improvisation which they've done after the campaign has started. This is very deliberate doctrine which they have in mind for a long time. Now let us look at in detail at their missile arsenal. What is the capability architecture? Before the war, they had about 2,000 medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching Israel. And they reconstituted it, that is between 2025 and by about February 2026, they reconstituted it to the near pre-war levels, aided by Chinese propellant shipments and Russian technical support. 500 plus missiles were fired at Israel in epic fury, and around 1,000 are assessed to be remaining as on April 4th. They have used different kinds of warhead based on the deliberate targeting logic. So the Fatah 1 and Hajj Qasim were used against runways and radar sites. The Khyber Shakan and Ghadar were used against reinforced structures. The Khorram Shar for maximum kinetic effect on hardened facilities. And submunition warheads against SAM arrays, that is ballistic SIAD. So therefore, no aircraft was required for that. In addition, the maneuverable re-entry vehicle and the hypersonic glide vehicle that was introduced through the IMAD, which has aerodynamic fin deflection. Therefore, it degrades the Patriot and Arrow's intercept geometry. The Fatah 1 adds a post-boost propulsion motor that accelerates and maneuvers the re-entry vehicle in the terminal phase, and this exhausts the THAAD's diversion capability. If we come to the Fatah 2, which was first launched on March 1st, 2026, which is, as per experts, claimed to be a true hypersonic glide vehicle. This maneuvers both in pitch and yaw at Mach 8 to 12, making predictive intercept geometry extremely difficult. The THAAD and the Arrow 3 both face degraded effectiveness, and Dimona and Arad struck despite multi-layered defenses. Dimona and Arad are key Israeli strategic targets.
And so, Brigadier Anil, actually, we must give credit to Iran for having studied and analyzed in detail the air defense capabilities of both Israel and the US forces deployed in the Gulf area, in West Asian area. So that they arrived at an architecture of saturating the enemy defenses so as to come to a method of defeating the defense by a design of its offensive attack capabilities, utilizing what is at its disposal. Firstly, the deployment of decoy swarms, drones being deployed, and also a single medium-range ballistic missile being capable of releasing dozens of radar and infrared mimicking decoys at hypersonic velocity. And this happening in the discrimination window when the air defense systems have to identify, decide, and designate and fire weapons to destroy this. Okay, each compressing the time frame for decision making available to the defender. Okay, and what it resulted in is launching of multi-million-dollar missile systems and weapon systems against what could be and what is definitely an inert replica, which leads to economic and financial mathematics coming in favor of the attacker. Then, as I mentioned in the beginning, multi-layer simultaneous launch of drones as well as missiles in salvos, okay, which actually what they did is they launched the drones at low as well as medium altitude to stress the Iron Domes. The short-range ballistic missiles at, once again, fairly high altitude and then coming down, which would stress the Patriot air defense systems. The medium-range ballistic missiles resulting in stress to the theater high-altitude air defense systems and the Arrow 2s of the Israelis. The Fatah 1 and 2, which could stress and which could, the saturation degrading the Arrow 3 missile systems of the Israelis. So, all tiers of air defense were engaged by the Iranian launch saturation strikes using missiles and drones, actually, which meant that the air defense system were not able to hold reserve capacity. This has obviously led to depletion of air defense systems. As I mentioned, the first 4 days itself, so nearly 1,000 of air defense systems being launched. And through mid-March, it was assessed that close to 3,500 interceptors were totally depleted. replenishing these is a huge task. It takes years and years to manufacture such kind of weapon systems, missile systems, with the kind of technological complexities that they have. And especially considering the production scale that US is capable of doing it today. Iran's drone productions, on the other hand, is to the tune of 10,000 units per month nearly, which means they can continue to do it. So, Iran does not need to defeat the defense. It just needs to empty it, which prevents resupply of it. Okay, the intercept deficit is actually compounding daily. Shahid drones that provokes a Patriot launch is a strategic victory. Imagine a $20,000 to $30,000 worth of a drone forcing $1 million air defense missile system, not as a million, close to $3.7 million cost. That's the cost. Yeah. At the same time, we see the strategic coercion coming into it. I'm sure.
So the Iran has, in its application of forces, has again adopted this asymmetric sort of warfare in which they've used the Hormuz Straits for strategic coercion, and that has now become the central lever of Iranian strategy. In the Straits of Hormuz, daily transits collapsed from 138 vehicles pre-war to 12 on April 2nd. So that's a 91% reduction. 10 plus oil tankers have been struck, 24 plus commercial vehicles hit, and Brent crude is $105. So, and the US gas prices have risen by 17 to 20%. So the selective enforcement of political warfare is Iran allows Indian, Chinese, Russian, Pakistani and Turkish shipping to pass. And of course, yesterday they have also allowed the first French ship to pass. So this is a deliberate signal separating the coalition's political base from the adversaries. And the toll gate mechanism, which they now being legislated in the Iranian parliament, is one in which these dues are settled in the Chinese yuan, which means that now these payments will be done independent of the United States dollar, thus further weakening the US stance there. To complicate the Strait of Hormuz, the Houthis have now threatened to close their choke point, which is the Bab el-Mandeb. Houthis entered the war on March 28th and they did 4 missile strikes through April 4th. And though the Bab el-Mandeb has not yet been closed, but if both are closed, it would simultaneously block 20 and 30% of the global oil trade. There is no historical precedent for this. And even the Saudi East-West pipeline is only partial relief. What Iran has also done is they have targeted the Gulf countries to punish the hosts of the US military bases. Thus, Bahrain and Kuwaiti desalination plants have been struck. The Ras Tunara oil terminal and the Ras Laffan LNG complex have also been targeted. And Amazon Web Service data centers in UAE have been disrupted. In other words, the American corporate interests are also being targeted. Dubai's airport has been shut temporarily, and the rentier economy is the target, not really the military. So the Iran, in my opinion, has won the economic battle without winning an air engagement. The supreme leader was killed, the air force was destroyed, and the navy has been sunk. But Iran still closed the world's most important energy choke point. That is the strategic lesson from this conflict. So now, sir, what do you think is likely to come next? What do you think will be the trajectory of the air and missile campaign in the next phase of operations?
It is quite difficult to predict it at this moment, considering multiple varying and changing narratives that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis. Okay. However, let's look at what is the strategic situation. I feel that we are looking at an endgame possibly without any closure. Okay. We've heard from the US leadership repeatedly that the objectives are nearing completion. As recently as 1st of April, as well as last night Indian time, when the American president came on TV and said, we are nearing completion of our objectives. Okay. And at the same time, they are been issuing ultimatums and extending deadlines. So the political endgame clock and the military campaign are obviously running at different speeds, is what one must guess. Okay, there is a talk of a 45-day ceasefire framework, which being apparently under negotiation via Islamabad with the intelligence of Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, as well as Egypt. But we must remember that there is a leverage, strong leverage, which you brought out a little earlier. That's a Hormuz. And the other aspect of the possession of enriched uranium, which the Israelis and Americans have not been able to detect or capture. Iran is not going to surrender any of this in a ceasefire-only deal. Okay, it is looking, as has been very clearly stated, it is looking at a final permanent settlement of a permanent ceasefire and guarantees of no attacks on its facilities anytime in future. Well, there have been reports that the president of Iran, Mr. Pezeshkian, privately warned its government that its economy could collapse in 3 to 4 weeks without a ceasefire being achieved in the near future. But at the same time, there are reports of nearly $100 billion being allocated by Iran for catering to a war which could last as long as 6 to 12 months or even 2 years. Okay, so this kind of an allotment could be as a diversionary tactic or a negotiating signal, and therefore is not a reliable estimate. So let's look at how the air campaign could evolve. We are now seeing talks of a counter-industrial phase having not only been talked about, it's also we are seeing the beginning of it at the moment. Okay, it could only deepen if unilateral ceasefire or a mutually agreed ceasefire, either of these not being achieved. Okay, so we see the missile factories, the drone assembly lines, propellant production, the steel industry, which provides a critical material for all these missiles and drones manufacture. Other component supply chains, all these are being attacked by US and Israel, especially by Israel. This is a long burn campaign, not a decisive strike. It is a campaign to degrade the industrial capacity and capability of Iran for its defense manufacturing. Effectiveness of this will require months of campaigning and not just merely a few days or weeks. Okay. The escalation threshold of Iran could be the energy infrastructure, but that's where their economy survives on, mostly on that. President Trump has threatened Iranian power plants. Iran has, at the same time, beforehand itself, threatened retaliatory strikes on Gulf Cooperation Council countries, desalination plants. The Gulf population depends entirely on, I would say, about 70 to 90% of their water supplies through the desalination plants. And also their economic infrastructure of oil and gas facilities. If the threshold of Iran is crossed by the Americans and the Israelis. So we haven't had a clear sign of this threshold being crossed as yet. But if that happens, the consequences would be tremendous and cascading consequences globally, bringing pain to you and me and the rest of the world, including the Europeans and the Americans. If energy infrastructure is struck, Iran's retaliation would target GCC oil terminals, LNG plants, desalination systems. European alliance will feel the pain too. Okay, they will face LNG supply. And that is a big challenge for them with approaching winters. The war globalizes through energy pricing within days. We are already seeing it. It could continue to go up. Sustenance of air campaign capability is a question mark with the limited number of B-2 fleet availability and the time taken for its maintenance, the complexity of maintenance. But total air superiority, their dominance could see a massive numbers of other fleet, like the B-52 coming in, complementing the air campaign.
On the Iranian side, obviously, the tempo is likely to be suppressed, but deliberate. 1,000+ missiles appear to be remaining, and Iran is likely to shift from mass saturation to precision conservation, targeting high-value nodes, remaining AWACS, tankers, command centers, and rather than burning through the entire inventory on saturation. The MARV and the HGV deployment is likely to increase. The Fatah 1-2 demonstrated that maneuvering systems can penetrate even layered US-Israeli GCC defenses. So we can expect Iran to prioritize these systems for remaining high-value strikes rather than conventional ballistic missiles. Proxy integration. Houthis are now active but measured. Hezbollah is fighting a ground war in Lebanon, and Iraqi militias are attacking US facilities. This coordination is widening in the battle space without Iran directly absorbing attrition. So the axis of resistance is functioning as a force multiplication and cost distribution mechanism. The drone warfare revolution, Hezbollah's fiber optic FPV drone debut against Israeli Merkavas in Lebanon, has been extremely successful and signals technology transfer from Russia via Iran. The fiber optic guidance defeats EW jamming, as this proliferates, the armored vehicle in contested terrain faces an existential challenge that no current Indian, US, or Israeli counter US system fully addresses. The trajectory of the conflict, to summarize, neither side can achieve a decisive military outcome in the air and missile domain. The US cannot bomb Iran into capitulation, and Iran cannot bomb the US out of the region. The endgame is diplomatic, but the side that retains more missiles, more interceptors, and more economic leverage when the talks begin wins the negotiation. Right now, Iran retains the Hormuz Strait. That is its trump card. Though we have so far in our assessment sort of said that there is unlikely to be a major ground campaign, notwithstanding what Trump says, but I thought it would be interesting to see what may happen in terms of air and missile employment in case of a ground campaign. So, just to set the scenario, a diplomatic stalemate persists, and Trump authorizes a forced maritime reopening, seizure of Kharg Island, which handles 90% of the Iranian crude exports, and or a marine amphibious assault to establish control of the Hormuz Narrows. Pentagon's final blow concept assessed as the seizure of Kharg, Larak Island, and Abu Musa in sequence.
So if that were to happen, I would presume that you will see the nature of US air campaign shifting substantially in its character. Okay, and I would see that in this eventuality, we could anticipate three near concurrent phases of operations by the US-Israeli campaign. The phase one will have, obviously, the need to suppress enemy air defenses and coastal defenses to facilitate a successful landing of troops. Okay, for this, we could see, with up to 200 kilometers from the coastline being at risk. Okay, we're utilizing A-10s, F-18s, the EA-18 Growler electronic warfare systems, and other attack systems at the disposal of Americans to ensure that littoral corridor is cleared. We could even see the B-2s coming into the theater to destroy hardened command and control bunkers, and also missile storage at Bandar Abbas, as well as on Kharg Island itself, in the hours before the assault. Once this is done, or near concurrently, we'll see the close air support and high-intensity missions happening to support the landing, to suppress any enemy ground-based and surface-based attacks or resistance to this. The F-35Bs from USS Tripoli could provide organic close air support without dependence on any land bases which are based in Gulf. Okay, because all these bases in the Gulf are within the range of Iran's missiles, as we already witnessed. Then we have the attack helicopters operating armed escort role for the MV-22 assault waves and engage the Iranian fast attack boat counterattack swarms. In the phase 3, which will run near concurrently, we could witness sustained air interdiction by B-52s and B-1Bs, striking the mainland logistics nodes in Iran, road and rail links leading to the coast, and whatever remaining IRGC ground force concentrations are seen. Okay. The air campaign then therefore becomes an interdiction operation to prevent Iranian reinforcement of the seized objectives. It's not a strategic bombing campaign. But a critical constraint in this is that air campaign must suppress the coastal anti-ship missile batteries like the Noor, Qadr, Khalij Fars, and also clear any sea mines which have been laid, and certainly laid there, before the operations and throughout the operations, any amphibious or other operations taking place. A single hit on a LHA or an LPD class of ship with 1,000 plus Marines on board is a catastrophic political event. This requires a level of SIAD which need to be completed that 37 days of epic fury thus far has not achieved.
Coming on to the Iranian missile and drone response, this would escalate sharply. I think ballistic missile and drone strike on the amphibious task force, Iran would immediately commit the remaining Fateh 110 Zulfikar and Khalji Fars anti-ship ballistic missiles against the carrier strike group, an amphibious ready group. In fact, yesterday there is a report of the USS Tripoli having been targeted by Iranian missiles in the Indian Ocean. This is the scenario that the IRGC Navy has wargamed for 20 years. Just for your information, the IRGC Navy doctrine, tactics, and equipment is different from the Iranian Artesh Navy, that is their regular navy. And the regular navy looks after operations in the Gulf of Oman and in the Arabian Sea, whereas it is the IRGC Navy which undertakes this kind of asymmetric naval warfare operations in the Persian Gulf. The straits narrow force ships into a predictable track, reducing the maneuver space that makes anti-ship ballistic missile targeting very difficult. Saturation of the beachhead with loitering munitions and coastal artillery once Marines are ashore on Kharg, 25 kilometers from the Iranian mainland, which means they're within the range of medium artillery. And the island is in the range of not only medium artillery, short-range rockets, armed UAVs, coastal gun systems, Shahed series drones in continuous waves. In the holding phase, not the landing, is the military problem. Full activation of the Strait mining campaign, Iran would immediately deploy naval mines, explosive USVs, midget submarines around the Hormuz Narrows. The very act of attempting to seize the strait, which is a precursor to landing troops, that itself would trigger the permanent closure that it aims to prevent. Mine clearing operations under fire are extremely dangerous and very, very slow and not really feasible. The unconditional proxy activation would undertake. Houthis would immediately close the Bab el-Mandeb. Hezbollah is likely to escalate the missile tempo against Israel. Iraqi militias would intensify attacks on all US facilities in Iraq. And Iran accepts that ground operations against its territory would trigger the full escalation across all fronts simultaneously. And pre-delegated authority means no command decision is required. Thus, the bottom line for a ground campaign is that the military logic is coherent, but the risk calculation is punishing. Kharg Island seized is equal to Iran's soil revenue cut. Strait control is equal to Hormuz reopen. But holding Kharg 25 kilometers from the Iranian mainland under sustained missile, drone and anti-ship fire with interceptor stocks already depleted is a different operation than seizing it. The US military has the capability to take Kharg, but holding it under fire for weeks against a regime that has nothing left to lose is the problem that no war game has cleanly resolved. So when we look at all this, what are the key takeaways for India?
Let's begin with certain India-specific lessons. I would say that there are many lessons, but I would like to list 7 out here. Firstly, we have seen that the Gulf countries have allowed hosting of US forces on its land. That has put them at risk. India has also signed logistics access agreement, that's LEMOA, with the US, which could create identical exposure risk. Recently, a former US general has claimed that the US Navy was falling back on Indian ports. Obviously, MEA denied it, and this could have been just a canard. The denial at the same time has confirmed a degree of anxiety on India's part. We must retain the ability to deny a facility if it adversely impacts our own interests. We must have the capacity and the strength to deny US or any other interested parties to deny the capability if it affects our interests. Because Iran or any other adversary could one day make the same calculation about Indian soil as Iran made about Bahrain. Second lesson, strong and wise allies do not bleed themselves while coming to the aid of another ally. Okay, Russia and China are possibly and evidently supplying intelligence, munitions, and diplomatic cover while keeping their own soldiers at home. They are testing out their own weapon systems, ISR systems, and other such things. India will face this configuration too when China comes to the assistance of our Western adversary, Pakistan, with ISR weapons and also UN cover, while obviously maintaining a plausible deniability. Lesson 3. Technological superiority and asymmetry cannot be deemed to be a permanent fix. Countermeasures will catch up. We need to have a mix of high tech as well as affordable tech in large quantity to provide a choice of employment. Survivability and redundancy of your most valuable equipment is a necessity that we cannot do away with. Another lesson, lesson number 4, the soldier is no longer the decisive variable. Netanyahu has apparently allocated 150 million US dollars to narrative warfare, information warfare, which is 20 times the past publicly announced diplomacy budgets of Israel. We know that India, has lost the narrative warfare of Operation Sindoor in spite of winning it decisively in the kinetic domain. Strategic communication, therefore, must be treated as a wartime capability and not a mere peacetime PR function.
And also another lesson is that the geography of risk has expanded. You had 3 nationals killed in the Strait. The AWS data centers serving Indian banks and tech firms have been struck in the UAE. And no non-combatant economy in the Indian Ocean region is insulated. Another lesson is that never strike first unless you can control the aftermath. The US struck first, it cannot end the war cleanly. So similarly, you have a Sindoor parallel where a 4-day war ended under US pressure and not on India's terms. A strike without termination strategy is an open-ended obligation. Another lesson is about the center of gravity. In the case of Iran, it has moved. It closed a 21-mile waterway and achieved more strategic effect than 900 airstrikes achieved against it. The Brent has hit 106. The WTI is up 40%, and Pentagon spent $5 billion in 2 days. So India must ask, what is China's equivalent choke point, and can India threaten it even without firing a shot? The overarching lesson of this is that decisive battles of this era are fought over choke points, economic systems, and narrative ecosystems. And India must build for all 3, not just the kinetic dimension that it instinctively prioritizes.
So let us now come to the China and Pakistan scenarios. To begin with, the Chinese scenario. The complexity of a possible China threat is actually several orders in magnitude. The People's Liberation Army's rocket force, which incidentally is the world's largest conventional missile force, is designed to neutralize enemy air bases. In our case, 2, even before the aircraft could get airborne. Tibet-based short-range ballistic missiles could target our northern and eastern air bases as well as air defense systems. The DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicles would successfully be employed against India's S-400, and which therefore has the same vulnerability as the THAAD and THAAD had against Fatah II in the Gulf. A lesson from Iran for us, therefore, is that even the US, with its dominance in stealth and full ISR, could not prevent Iranian missiles striking US and Israeli bases. The IAF, without any stealth, would face an even more compressed decision window under a Chinese first strike. Let's look at the Chinese drone swarms and the PLA rocket forces combined first strike scenario. We have been, I'm sure, of our tri-services organizations have been, but we must continue to focus on this aspect, and our war games must center on this. The Iran war makes it less theoretical and a more contemporary operational imperative, is what I would say.
Absolutely. And the same is true for Pakistan. I'm sure they must be looking at great interest, how to a military which is grossly asymmetric to the United States and Israel has managed to hold its own and create, you can say, excellent, superior strategic effects. So Iran's drone and missile playbook, in which cheap saturation against expensive interceptors, is directly available to Pakistan via Chinese technology transfer. Shaheen ballistic missiles, Babur cruise missiles, and a growing loitering munition program can collectively replicate Iranian saturation logic against India's forward air bases. Two-front simultaneous missile drone saturation. India's interceptor stockpile, which consists of a handful of S-400 batteries, nascent Akash, is insufficient. And the depletion calculus Iran applied to the US applies with equal force to India.
So, would you like to say that India should establish a conventional rocket force then?
I feel quite strongly that a conventional force would be very, very useful. You see, Iran imposed strategic level
Conventional rocket force.
rocket force, a conventional rocket force. Iran imposed strategic level effects on the world's most powerful military without a dedicated rocket force structure. The PLRF model, dedicated command, ISR doctrine, launcher survivability, is the more complete realization of this concept. India has neither. What a CRF requires is, short-range ballistic missiles, 150 to 500 kilometers, for battlefield interdiction of forward Chinese air bases and Pakistani airfields. Medium-range ballistic missiles, 500 to 2,000 kilometers, for theater strike against Hotan, Kashgar, and Gwadar. And maneuverable re-entry vehicle warheads on key systems to defeat the HQ-9 and the S-400 terminal defenses of the Chinese. And nascent HGV capability to hold or to penetrate the hardened command and control at risk. The economics of the center of gravity argument. China's maritime supply chains, the Malacca Straits, the Indian Ocean region, sea lines of communication to the Gulf, are more vulnerable to the Indian Navy interdiction than to ballistic missile strike. Indian Navy is better positioned to threaten China's economic choke point than any land-based missile force. And the two capabilities are complementary and not alternatives. Another issue is the launcher survivability is non-negotiable. Iran's TELs survived because they were dispersed, camouflage, and pre-positions. India's Himalayan terrain offers natural concealment. Road mobile systems with pre-surveyed height sites and rapid shoot and scoot protocols are the model.
So, to sum it up, so without a credible conventional strike capability that can actually threaten Chinese military infrastructure effectively deep inside its territory, our deterrence, India's deterrence, depends entirely on nuclear escalation, a threshold which no conventional conflict should require crossing. Therefore, the conventional rocket force I am convinced, will fill the deterrence gap between the conventional defeat and the requirement to use nuclear forces.
Excellent. So when we look at the entire campaign issue, there are certain strategic imperatives which emerge. First is the suppression of air defense capability. Dedicated suppression force, in our case, Rudram series of anti-radiation missiles, jamming pods, low observable platforms, all these are required to neutralize adversaries' SAMs on day one. The war confirms that this is the first operational problem, not the last. The conventional rocket force, ideally a tri-service CRF with SRBMs, MRBMs, and MARV warheads, separate from the Strategic Forces Command, which has nuclear weapons, and which is modeled on the PLA RF, modified and scaled for India. The third requirement is a drone force at scale, thousands of loitering munitions, not hundreds, thousands. Indigenous male US systems, autonomous swarm capability, fiber optic FPV fielded to all armored formations with cage armor, and APS upgrades are immediate priorities. Similarly, interceptor stockpiles and directed energy weapons. This we need to expand it massively so that the interceptor inventory is not affected by the depletion problem, which is existential at Indian scale. We need to fast track energy weapon development as the asymmetric cost cutter.
The current war also proves the importance of strengthening and hardening the protection of our forward bases and assets. Okay. The very fact that the air bases, which were hitherto assumed to be deep enough in the Gulf area, they became priority targets just as much as forward bases. Blast protection by way of hardened and deeply buried shelters, camouflage, concealment, and also decoys, along with strong networked air defense with sufficient redundancy, are a must for India. The force enablers, even if they are positioned way behind in deep bases, would also need us, as evident from the Gulf theater. India's integrated air and missile defense command and control systems need to be strengthened further against kinetic and non-kinetic attacks. Now, this is possible from both fronts against us, both China and Pakistan fronts. Redundancy in command and control architecture must be capable of effective two-front simultaneous threat management, therefore. We have seen the movie-like, or we heard about the movie-like recovery of the downed air crew. So combat search and rescue, or CSAR missions with the F-15 of the pilots, which happened within 48 hours, employing hundreds of special operation forces, deception operations by the CIA. These are a big reminder for India that operating over contested airspace demands a robust CSR capability. We have it, we've been practicing it, but we need to focus on bolstering this capability and the capacity. If an IAF pilot goes down over Tibet or Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, the outcome could be different.
I also would like to highlight the importance of, the strategic narrative. Iran won the economic battle without winning an air engagement. India lost the Sindoor narrative despite winning kinetically. Strategic communications, that is pre-conflict framing, real-time information operations, post-conflict narrative control, all these must be resourced as much as any other wartime capabilities.
So a final thought is that the US-Iran conflict is the live demonstration of 21st century warfare at scale. Iran closed a 21-mile waterway and achieved a bigger strategic effect than close to 1,000 airstrikes achieved against it. We in India are fortunate to have a ringside seat and but a narrow window to absorb these lessons before our adversaries fully exploit them. The center of gravity in modern war has possibly moved to, I cannot say it with certainty, but has possibly moved to choke points like economics and narrative warfare. We must cater to and must build for all three. Thank you. Thank you for listening to us. Looking forward to more interaction with our listeners.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.